Welcome to the 2012 Rachel Carson Distinguished Lecture. And my name is Jack Liu. I'm the Rachel Carson Chair in Sustainability. And the Rachel Carson Lecture series is named by the pioneer in modern environmental movement, Rachel Carson. As you know, she's the author of famous book, Silent Spring. And the purpose of this lecture series is to provide a platform for world's leading scholars to share their wisdom and their insights with the MSU community and the general public. And the lecture is organized by the Center for Systems Integration and Sustainability, Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at MSU, and is co-sponsored by the National Science Foundation, the Office of the President at MSU, the Office of the Provost, and the Office of the Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies, and the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and also agrobio research. And I saw our acting dean here, Dr. Buer, and also Steve Puppy here represented the agrobio research. And also John Baker is here too. So the administrators are busy, but to take time to come here to enjoy the talk rather than to have another meeting. Also, the lecture is made possible by the support from the center staff and students like Vicky and Sue and Jamie and Abby Lynch and Bill and so on and so forth. And also the Kellogg Center here. And after this lecture, we'll have a reception over there so we can chat and ask more questions to the speakers. Today is our great honor and pleasure to have another world-renowned scientist to give this year's lecture. So now I'd like to have Phil Taylor, University Distinguished Professor, to introduce our speaker. So let's welcome Phil.
Thanks, Jack. I'm very pleased to introduce our Professor Ian Cowx, who is the Director of the International Fisheries Center at the University Hall and a professor at the University Hall in England. He is also going to receive the Honorary Doctorate of Science on Friday's graduation ceremony, and so be our newest Honorary Doctor of Science candidate and the recipient. So we're very, very pleased to have you here on this. I have had the pleasure to work very closely with Professor Cowx over a number of years now, as we've done a study abroad program in the UK, which he's been instrumental helping. He's sponsored undergraduate students and graduate students, and been heavily involved in calling for a UN conference on inland fisheries. So Professor Cowx has been a prolific educator. Among his many accomplishments, he is most proud of having been the mentor of over 30 PhD students and more than 300 Masters of Science students. And these students come from upwards of 80 countries around the world. So he truly is an international scientist. A distinction I don't think that any other fishery scientist can match. He has hosted our students, and he collaborated with MSU and many other universities for comparative studies of freshwater fisheries around the world. These efforts have aided in the development of a growing international network of young fishery professionals connected to one another, and through Professor Cowx's amazing efforts to improve our understanding of governance and management of the world's freshwater fisheries and human communities dependent upon them. To say the least, Professor Cowx's impact on fisheries has been huge. He has collaboratively developed effective fishery management plans and capacity building in Lake Victoria, Kafue Flats in Zambia, Lake Volta in Ghana, and has also been intimately involved in taking action to protect freshwater fisheries from dam developments and other forms of habitat degradation in such places as Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia, Mekong River basin countries, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the list goes on. Professor Cowx is also assisting development of conservation plans for endangered fish species in Portugal and Greece that have successfully led to their protection. And due to his outstanding achievements in not only what I've already stated, but other areas, in the international community, Professor Cowx has been presented the prestigious International Fishery Science Prize this past May at the World Fishery Congress in Edinburgh, Scotland. He has produced over 180 peer-reviewed scientific fishery publications, edited 14 books, and 200 plus technical reports dealing with a range of contemporary issues regarding freshwater fishery science and management. Professor Cowx also serves as acting co-editor for the International Journal of Fisheries Management and Ecology, and is a member of the editorial board for ecohydrology and hydrobiology, and being a referee on many other academic journals. It is my great pleasure to welcome my close friend and distinguished colleague, Professor Ian Cowx.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill, for those accolades. I have to say that you don't achieve all those sorts of things on your own. There are many people behind that, particularly my colleagues at the institute that I run in Hull. I've got a fantastic working group. Some of you here will know them. They really have supported me a lot. And the other person that supported me is my wife, who would like to have been here, actually. It's a shame she couldn't. What I want to do today is actually talk about things that I've dealt with in the real world out there, some of the projects that Bill has just mentioned just now, and also look at how things have changed in inland fisheries. Being here, I find quite an accolade anyway, because it's a recognition that inland fisheries are important. Something that I've been striving for all my career, in fact, for 35 years, my career, to try and make them important and get them in the public arena. It's not easy, particularly when you're working in developing countries. And what I want to do is actually look here at how we're changing the thought process a little bit towards this concept of ecosystem services, which is evolving incredibly rapidly. And I want to show you how we've tried to use it in inland fisheries, or how we're beginning to try to use it in inland fisheries. And you may find some of the concepts applicable to any other natural resource activity. But before I start, I just want to come back to this. Jack mentioned Rachel Carson and what she did in this famous book, Silent Spring. And there's a lovely statement in it, in the acknowledgements. I can't say I'd read the whole book, but I certainly read the acknowledgements, because they're always interesting. And I love the statement here that she pays tribute to the people fighting the thousands of small battles. And I think we're all around this table, we're all doing that. I would recognize that. Certainly that's what I feel, and they are small sometimes. And that sanity and common sense, that are usually lacking, come to prevail. But I would actually say the challenge this poses for us in the 50 years since the book was published, because it is 50 years since it was published, is what are we doing, what are we going to do to help make that challenge happen? And I challenge you. What are you doing to make that challenge happen? I spent all my life out there trying to make it happen, and the little bits really do add up. So any little bits of effort, I would suggest, is following along what Rachel Carson is trying to achieve. What I want to do today, though, is actually give you a challenge for those from the school down here. Here's your latest challenge, which your professor will give you when you get back tomorrow. Your assignment is to write an essay on why the future looks so bright. The positive side of things rather than negative. Let's look forward. Let's be positive in the real world. But what I want to do here is actually look at inland fisheries, and I want to look at conservation in general terms. And so I want to have a look, how important are inland fisheries? Something that's really overlooked. So I want to give you a perspective on that. I then want to have a look at current fish conservation management practice as I see them across the world, and particularly in our European context, and partly in the North American context. And I want to show you why I think they're not working. I then want to have a look at some of the responses that we have to these sorts of practices. And then I finally want to have a look at this concept of ecosystem services. And I want to show you two case studies. One is the Kafue Flats in Zambia, which Bill mentioned earlier. And the other one is the Mekong. One is where this concept, I think, has functioned and worked well. And one where we had a complete failure. And I want to show the contrasts and why I think it happened. But as I'm going through this, please recognize that conservation is more than single species actions. And that's, I think, one of the big problems we face. We always look at a species, we have a pet species, and I have one myself. It's a Portuguese little species. It's about this big, called Anacypris hispanica, and it's no use to nobody. It's a minnow. Great, who cares? I care. And the reason I care is because we think it's the origins of the New World species. So it has an important legacy. And so I care, and I also like the Portuguese wines that go with it. Okay, so what about the importance of these fisheries globally? This is one of the shorelines of Lake Victoria, the gillnet fishermen on Lake Victoria. But I want to show you how important it is. You can see there's a lot of people here, and I'll come back to this lot of people in the future. When you have a look at the global trends in fisheries, these are the sorts of figures you get. You get the increase in global marine capture, which is going up and actually levelling off, and until very recently was much the main source of our fish resources in the world. The green represents aquaculture, which has just grown exponentially. And in 2010, the latest data that's available from FAO, aquaculture production was greater than marine fish delivery and production, which is a frightening thought. And I always say to my students, why is it frightening? Basically because what feeds these? Unfortunately, it's the marine stuff. But I'm dealing with this little blue line down here. You know, this insignificant little bit that's always left at the bottom rung of the ladder, we're always left out the game. And I just want to show, deal with that. But before I do, the picture we often get for the marine fisheries scenarios is this one, where you've got these global trends in marine fish stocks and where we're going, and you end up with these sort of three criteria of overexploited stocks, fully exploited stocks, and non-fully exploited stocks, which basically the levels of exploitation that are going on. And what you've actually got in that graph I showed, and the marine capture starting to decline, is that our fully exploited and overexploited stocks are going up. There are arguments actually that's not as bad as it looks, but let me show you it's still a trend I wouldn't like to talk about too much. But this is what we see for marine fisheries. They're in trouble as such. Freshwater fisheries, you end up with these data. Now this is broken down into the different regions of the world, the different continents of the world. And the black represents the trends in global fish capture. They're upwards. So what's the problem? If you have a look at these upward trends, they're based on Asia, this lady here. They're based on Africa, which actually is almost exclusively to do with Lake Victoria. It dominates that catch. And then when you have a look at Europe and North America, we come along here. The European one, actually, the green comes along here and then drops and then picks up here. This is because you've got the Soviet Union and those sorts of former Soviet Union coming in. So this is European context. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the inland fisheries capture starts to decline. And that's because people in Europe don't eat freshwater fish. We don't like it. Carp tastes like cotton wool. And it's not, well, I don't think it's very pleasant, but that's another story. Maybe other people have an idea. And North America, you have got a very static trend. So these are the two big ones. The trouble with these is that represents improved catch statistics. We're improving our knowledge of what's going on in the various Asian countries, so we're getting a better handle of what's going on. It's nothing to do with what's the trends. In reality, this has been going on forever. It's just we're recording it better now. And so the statistics look good, but they aren't. And if you can actually extrapolate this backwards, as we have tried to do recently, you find that the trend is slightly up, but that's only because of more people fishing. It's nothing to do with, that's the real picture. So they've always been important, and probably 3 or 4 times more important than they're recognised by the figures today. I also want to put the importance of this in terms of global food security. To show you the role of fisheries, and I love this graph, this table, because what it's doing is putting where the sources of protein are from across the world. And what you've actually got is, I think you can see the importance of fisheries. They are fundamental as a protein source. And I always like looking at pig meat is pretty high, but I always look like sheep because I have some very good Australian and New Zealand friends, and I ask them to eat their heart out because inland fish, which sits in here, is more important than that. So inland fisheries is fundamental to it. I have to say that that part does fit in there. I'll cheat a little bit. But it's still the recognition of inland fisheries. And these are data which are weak because the reality is it doesn't include capture from recreational fishing. And a colleague of mine, I estimated that something like 47 billion fish were caught annually globally, of which quite a high proportion were taken away and eaten. Maybe you do it, you catch a fish and take them home and eat them. That's not recorded at all. And what you haven't got is the high proportion of what we call subsistence fisheries, which are unaccounted for, they're unreported. And those data I showed you from Asia show that. There is probably a huge amount of people who literally just go down the river like you've just got here, go and catch a fish, take it home and eat it. And that's not recorded. And it is millions of people doing that daily. So where is it? I also want to just have a look at the relationship between inland fisheries and different parts of the world, just to put some perspective on this as well. Here you guys are sitting over here. The importance of inland fisheries there and fisheries from all sources to your diet. Not a lot actually, not very good fish eaters, are you? It's good for you, you know. But the importance here is sort of recognition of the regional perspectives. Here in Asia and what we call the least developing countries, so that's most of Africa, Caribbean and some of those areas, the importance of fish is high. So we really have to think about protecting them. And when you actually look at this one here, this is also least developed countries, this is the inland fisheries component. So it's huge. So inland fisheries and fisheries as a whole probably represent 60% of the protein intake. To me, that's important. That's what I'm trying to strive for in the work that I do. There's also one other thing that you ought to recognise, or a couple of other things that we ought to recognise in inland fisheries. They're not just a source of protein, they are a source of essential micronutrients. These are the things we need to stay healthy. Take that away, what are those people going to have? No protein, no micronutrients, very ill, very poor growth rates, very poor survival rates. And also, fisheries in general, but inland fisheries in particular, have a very, very small ecological footprint. And I'll show you what I mean by this. Here's your ecological cost of producing 40 grams of protein from different sources, and I thank Ray Hilborn for this, I forgot to acknowledge this. But you've actually got the amount of water, fertilizer, pesticides, antibiotics, and soil loss associated with the different production units. So beef, chicken, pork, dairy, and capture fisheries. And look at these huge figures. And then look at little old fisheries down here. We have a beautiful ecological footprint. In fact, we don't have one. So in reality, we're not causing the environmental damage that's leading to climate change and all these sorts of things. Although there's probably a little bit more wrapped in there. But in general terms, it's a clean mechanism of food production. Fantastic. The other thing on fisheries that I ought to mention is that worldwide there's about 44 million fishermen, a lot of people working in fish, and most of them are involved in the capture sector, and most of these, 90% of them, are in Africa and Asia. So those figures of least developed countries in Asia is where a lot of this focus is, and many of them, surprisingly, even though the capture rate is small and the amount of fish is small, most of them are small-scale inland fisheries people. So they actually they go out and catch a few fish, feed their families, they're subsistence fishing, and they're supporting it. So there's a huge proportion of people who are dependent on them for their livelihoods, for their food security, and all that type of stuff. The approximate dependence on these fisheries as well is about 8% of the world population, which is quite huge as far as I'm concerned. Final thing I want to mention about inland fisheries and why we should really look after them is that in many parts of the world that I work in, if you haven't got a job or you have a natural disaster, what do you do for social security? In this country, presumably the US will give you a little bit of money to look after yourself. Like in the UK, the government will pay some support to keep you at least in food and somewhere to live. In this part of the world, none of that. So the easiest option is to go to these inland fisheries. They are the last resort. They're the social security system of these people. Very important to maintain them. So where are we going? Unfortunately, unlike marine fisheries, which are mostly exploitation driven, inland fisheries are hammered by everything under the sun. And you think, just go out on your local river and have a look what's hitting that river. We have exposure to all sorts of things. And I've just got a few of them back here. There is some overfishing taking place on inland fisheries. This picture here is 15 tons of carp being taken out of a pond in Romania. And that's typical of the exploitation pressures that can take place. We have dams. I hate the word. Dams are causing huge problems and because they're blocking all sorts of migration routes and everything else and changing flows. And I'll come back to this in a big way. We have pollution. Not so much of a problem in westernized culture now because we're aware of water quality issues and we've done a lot to improve it. But you go to China and have a look what's going on there. You go into many parts of Africa. Pollution is not a problem. It is not considered an issue. It just happens. And so fisheries are being hammered. You've got habitat loss. You've got what we call land drainage with flood protection works. We're actually taking out lots of our rivers and making them deeper and wider to get rid of the water quickly, ruining the habitats. We've got alien species coming in everywhere. This is actually out of the British newspaper, Brits, talking about the northern pike being introduced into New York area, eating all your little darters. That's the same thing as my little Anacypris in Portugal. And we've got things like sex-change fish. I mean, if you want to eat a fish out of the River Thames in London, I can guarantee it's female. They're all female. How they breed is another issue. Most people tell me, and from work I've done elsewhere, they can actually do it through a process called hybridogenesis. So they kick out the male. They don't need males anymore. And don't you girls think about anything here. But the reality is that is actually happening. And so, but the populations are still staying. But the pressures are on these systems. Unfortunately, most of the management is, as I've said, single species driven. And I'll just go through a few now in a minute. But, sorry, I meant to just talk about this. In terms of the pressures on the fish and fish stocks and inland fish stocks, you end up with many fish becoming threatened, endangered, and all these IUCN sort of criteria. And actually, if you have a look at what's going on in fisheries, take out this purple line for a minute. If you have a look at the status of our inland fish stocks, what you end up finding is that the number of extinct species has been fairly static over the years that have gone extinct over the last 10 years. It's fairly static. If you have a look at the number of imperiled species, it's going up, and the number of vulnerable species is going up. And this is a result of what's going on. The issue you've got here with this one, this is of least concern. And what's happening with the IUCN, and what I am extremely worried about at the moment, is IUCN are presenting these sorts of data. If I sit down here in 2006, 55% of the fish that have been recorded were actually assessed as extinct or in decline. Very worrying. Come to 2011, it's down to 37%. Because what they're doing is they're going out and looking at the status of more and more fish species and finding they're on this least concern pathway. And so they're diluting the problems that are facing inland fisheries. It's a real problem. Here are some of the problems that are causing those extinctions and imperilment, which makes quite nice reading, I suppose, or not, as however you want to look at it. And what you've actually got is the main reason for extinctions is not things like dams, which are a problem. They're causing imperilment and vulnerability, but extinctions are mostly caused by things like invasive species, problems you've got over here. They're caused by biological resource use, which is some overexploitation, and you've got this one, which is pollution. They're causing it. And then urbanization is sort of common across all of them. Interestingly, climate change is coming in. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Most fish species have these tolerances. What we're finding in Europe is they're not going extinct, they're just migrating north. They're coming further and further north. And the reason they're coming north is that the anglers are moving them north because they want to still catch fish. So they're replacing and substituting. And actually, they become invasive, so you sort of start falling in this route. So we have some problems with what's going on. How do we deal with this? Here's some of the fisheries I deal with in my life. This is Lake Victoria again. This is the Mekong, typical Mekong catch from the dye fisheries. How do we deal with it? When you have a look through the literature, it makes quite interesting reading, and it's broken down into conservation, fisheries management conservation measures that take place, and I've broken down to the main ones. And what you've got are protected areas is one of the main routes. Nature reserves. We all deal with nature reserves, I would imagine, if you're in biology and conservation. Nature reserves. We deal with restoration, whatever that is, because restoration is to put it back to what it was originally, and let me tell you, that ain't going to happen in most parts of the world. We've got biological monitoring. So we monitor it, but what does that do? You know, it's great. Oh, it tells you they're endangered. We've got stock enhancement, which I've shown you invasive species is the problem. So you're adding fish, which is also a problem. Then we've got legislation, integrated management, public awareness, and eradication of exotics. Great. The three main ones here, or these two and this one, I just want to have a look at. These are our measures that we're putting in place, but are they functioning? And I would suggest and show you and argue that perhaps they're not working as well as they should be. These are typical restoration measures in Europe. We've got bank erosion taking place, so we stabilise the banks. What's that doing for the fish? I'm not sure. It's more to protect the land, so the farmers are happy. Here we've got half-log weirs to increase habitat diversity. So you've got upstream areas for fish that like slightly slower flowing, and then downstream areas for fish that like flowing waters, and it does have some benefits. Here we're putting in rock boulder replacements in the middle of London, just to add some habitat feature for fish. I'll show you the benefits of that shortly. And this is typical of the River Rhine, or the River Vaal, in fact, a tributary of the River Rhine in the Netherlands, and they're realigning the floodplain and putting it outwards. So this is still the Vaal River, the main navigation coming through, and they've reconnected the old floodplains. That, large-scale, multi-million-dollar projects, huge costs. Here we have some fish passes. These are typical solutions in the UK, but nature-like bypass channels, which look like this, so they recreate nature, and I'll bear that in mind because I'll come back to it later. And then typical pool riffle characteristics and pool traverse fish passes, which are mechanisms for actually getting fish upstream where they were previously blocked by various barriers. They work, but you can get the fish up to the headwaters, but if the habitat's not there for them to spawn, what use is it? And in fact, we're seeing lots of these measures going in, but we're not seeing much returns on them. So I would suggest that restoration is utopian. It's an ideal world. We're not going to get there. We're actually rehabilitating or remediating most of the time, or in some cases, I think we're just gardening. I don't think we know enough about what we're doing anyway. The work and research that's going into inland fisheries and the importance of inland fisheries, particularly in our river systems, is marginal. My university, my institute, is the only institute, an academic institute in the UK of 147 universities that actually works on inland fisheries, which I think is an indictment of what's going on. We don't know where the bottlenecks in the life cycles of many of these fish are, because we're not doing the research to test it out. The projects are often localized, just as I've shown you in those previous pictures, a fish pass, a little revetment, or something of that nature, and you're not dealing with the bigger picture and the bigger problem. And this is because at the end of many financial years, people like our environment agency have a little bit of money, so what we're going to do with it? So they're going to stick a fish pass in there or do that, but they don't have joined up thinking. And much of these, the lack of planning with no clear objectives, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the elimination of species is almost unrealistic. It's not going to happen because it's so complex to virtually eradicate any from water bodies, in particular rivers. But this lack of planning, if I can get it to work. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to it. Another one about restoration. This is typical of what's going on in the UK. Does that look good to you? It looked quite a nice river, apart from the Ocker, because it's just downstream of a mine outfall, coal mine outfall. But that's the sort of river I'd expect, at least hydromorphologically, I'd expect it to look like that. Riffles, trees, all sorts. It looks fairly pristine. Because of floods that are occurring in Britain at the moment and across Europe, we're getting consistently high floods. What we're doing is actually changing things, and we're going back to what we did in the 70s to improve the land drainage. And this is the same site. Hope you recognise it. The ironic part is they took all the trees out. Why, we don't know, because they weren't causing the flood problems. They took all the gravels out and created this very linear, about this deep water body, a river, and surprise, surprise, there's not many fish there. The ironic part is they also found a new weir here because they dug out the gravels. And so they found a new weir, so they had to build a fish path to get over that weir. Wonderful. And then you get structures like this one. This is my favourite photograph of all. This is a rehabilitation centre in the centre of London. The River Wandle, it runs through Wandsworth. The only advantage of this is they make nice beer just upstream. You get my drift before long. This is great. These are Chinese restaurants all here, and they were just pouring their effluent straight into the river, so they piped them all together and dumped it further downstream. And that is a river, yes. So these are sorts of problems we've got. Other problems we've got, this is another one, a classic one in the UK. Another problem we've got, this is an old a river up in the northeast of England in a place called Darlington, a straightened river, more or less. And what we tend to try and do is improve the qualities of our rivers by rehabilitating them. And this is actually what they did at a cost of 1.1 million euros. That's about, I know it's about $1.5 million, something like that, euros. And they put the bends back in the river and landscaped it a little bit. And the cost, over 1 million euros. The impact was zero, in fact. And I'm being polite, negligible. It was zero, because they forgot that just up here is the major sewage works for this huge urban centre, and it discharged its water downstream, and nothing will ever recover until they sort the sewage works. So they didn't sort the problem out. The other problem is that lots of people now walk their dogs along here, and they don't look after what dogs leave behind. So it's not the most pleasant place to walk anymore. So these are the sorts of problems we've got. The other thing which I want to touch on is that many of the projects we've actually got, these are typical of California. Matt Condolf gave me these data, and what you've actually got is the different types of measures that take place. The worst part of that is it looks good, you're doing lots of actions, but only 22% of them reported any monitoring and any output of whether they're effective or not. And actually 11 had no reason for doing them, they just did them. So these are the sorts of issues we're dealing with at the moment. We haven't got joined up thinking, joined up writing. With protected areas, I'll be very quick on this. Basically, the protected areas are rarely set up for fish. They're usually set up for some other species, and fish just happens to be hanging around, so they may get the benefit from it. We also don't know enough about the distribution of many of our fish. They do move up and downstream. There's a lot of thinking that fish are resident and they just stay there. Let me tell you, they don't. They move miles and miles, to say the least. The areas designated also don't look at the important parts of the life cycle, such as the spawning area, and connect the spawning area with the nursery areas, with the feeding areas. They're usually just one area that's available to you. And fish generally are not given much priority. They're usually just ignored. They just happen to be there. They can't be seen, so, oh, well, we won't worry about fish. We'll worry about birds and otters and all these sorts of things. Unfortunately, the birds and otters often eat the fish, but they forget that link. And I can tell you some good stories about that later if you want. And actually, people are not very aware of these conservation issues as such. Stocking, and here we have a lovely bit of stocking. This is the British stocking flying fish here. What you've actually got is, this goes on all over the place, and this is typical of what we see, lots of fish stocked to recover the populations. The reality is, these, over the years, have been the way to deal with it, to overcome the problem, and are they addressing it? Well, I'll show you my thought processes. Generally, the answer is no, they're just short-term fixes. They're not dealing with the problem. They're not addressing the bottlenecks to the system at all, and the bottlenecks to the recruitment, and so you have to do it forever and a day. And that's probably the same sorts of things happening over here as is happening with us. We're losing our genetic diversity because of the stocking, because every time you breed one cycle, you lose 50% of your diversity, more or less, is what they're suggesting now. You've got to get your fish on these conservation species from somewhere, so there's got to be a donor stock, so you put more pressure on them. And artificial rearing techniques for many of the species that we've been dealing with just don't exist. When you've got fish this size, it's very difficult to breed them. So they just don't exist. So you're actually taking fish from a stressed population already to put into another population which is even more stressed. And the reality is you haven't taken the bottleneck away, so you've got all sorts of problems. So, apologies to the couple of people who may have seen this slide before. I love this slide. This is a slide of 5 blind men describing an elephant. And they're at different parts of the elephant. My favourite, I'll leave you to read it, but my favourite's this guy here. And basically what this is trying to say to you is, are we actually fixating on something small and forgetting the big issues, the wider issues, the bigger picture? Are we not thinking outside the box? Are we missing something? We're missing the whole picture. And I suggest we are. And with many of the activities I've talked about before, we're dealing with very small, fragmented parts of the problem, and we're not dealing with the whole. And if I go back to this graph, and look in the actions, I would suggest that many of these activities that are taking place, the red ones marked up here, are really Western anthropogenic driven strategies. Basically, we have the money to be able to do it, and so we are doing it now. You go into Africa and ask them to do protected areas. These guys are dependent on this food. You tell them they can't go in there and take the fish that they've lived off for their lives. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? You're asking them to restore habitat. Well, blimey, you know, it just isn't going to happen. In fact, if you go to some Western countries now, like Greece, they're not going to do that either, unless the Germans are going to bail them out. So we have problems now with our austerity measures that are taking place across Europe. So some of these things are beginning to fall out in our part of the world. So basically, we're doing, to me, globally, we're doing the wrong thing. And I'll suggest this in terms of freshwater fish. These are 2 graphs which hopefully you can see. You don't need to see them very much, except that where are the main fish species, the main diversity? The main fish species are in the tropical regions, the fish diversity which we need to protect. The main capture are similar. Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Africa. These are the big areas. So we're addressing, or trying to address the problems with solutions that don't work in these areas. So, come back to my friend Peanuts. Do we need to think what we're doing? And I would suggest yes. Great cartoon here. I'll leave you. Can you all read it? Basically, thanking you for submitting the plans. And regret they don't actually fit. So we've got to rethink something. This actually was about submitting a scientific paper, and regret it didn't suit the needs of the journal. And there's a follow-up one which she says, if it ever does, we'll close the journal down. Okay, so what's the way forward? One of the strategies that's coming out of FAO, UN, those sorts of people, is this one, the ecosystem approach. So this is actually now trying to think the whole. So the frameworks are developed, and they've been developing now over the last 10 years, and this is the proposal that people are putting forward. Unfortunately, me being me, I dissected this, and personally, I actually don't think this system works. It's designed for marine systems, and I've shown you the problem, so it's designed for marine stock overexploitation, not for inland fisheries, which the problems are external to the fishery mostly. And really, this system, at the moment as it stands, it remains very much fisheries orientated. It's based on marine perspectives, I just said, and the wider interaction with other users which is absolutely fundamental to understanding this, is actually largely ignored when you really look deep into it. And the worst part is external economic drivers, so this is what's driving these fisheries and everything else, are overlooked, and what the impact of other activities and the value of those other activities are ignored within this system. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in a second. But I just want to mention just a statement, and I use this most times when I lecture because I think it's got to be the best statement I've ever read. Unfortunately, it's driven by Mrs. Thatcher's economic advisor at the time, and Mrs. Thatcher is not a friend of mine. But Richard Rogers, basically discussing sustainable cities, made a lovely statement. Economics is all about getting hold of tomorrow's money today. And you think about that statement, it's wonderful, because basically where's the incentive for conservation? Where's the incentive for looking after the ecology, the environment, the natural environment? And under the austerity measures that we're getting in Europe now, our British government has made a statement in the last couple of weeks to state that they're now going to think about jobs and forget the environment. And virtually, those are the words they used. Frightening. Absolutely frightening. There's also one other problem. This whole issue of economics doesn't really resolve this poverty issue. And poverty, where in many parts of the world where I'm working, is a fundamental issue. And it doesn't resolve poverty because poverty and sustainable livelihoods are intrinsically linked, and economics is linked to it. And if I show you this diagram, I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Here, poverty is driven by a whole series of different actions. You've got bad governance causes poverty, and by governance you can put corruption in there if you want. Low academic achievements, lack of income, people don't have any voice, no security, and they're really vulnerable to any environmental shocks. And this causes poverty. Poverty, if you're sitting, and the example I often use is if you're by the side of a water body and you find a fish, and it's the last of its kind, it goes extinct. What do you do? What would you do? And this guy's caught this fish, this poor guy, very, very poor. And would you say, well, I need that fish because it's the last of its kind. I need to put it in my bottle of whiskey and then take it away and pickle it forever in the British Museum or the American Museum of Natural History. This was suggested to me once, that that's what I ought to do if it ever happens to me. And I said, I'll let him eat it. But unfortunately, it leads to environmental degradation, and that's a problem. But on top of it, affluence, Europe, North America, sorry to say it, basically, we're driving this because of our demands for resources, and we're driving environmental degradation outside our own environments. We often look after our own, but forget about others. So we're driving this environmental degradation. And so the affluence is causing a lot of the problems. So we have overconsumption globally causing environmental degradation. So economics is driving us and driving the environment. So what are the solutions? Again, a nice, lovely cartoon. And before you ask me the answer to this question of what the answer is, there it is. Okay, so what solution strategy we've actually got? I would suggest that what we've got to start thinking about is not detach the ecology and the environment, which is what a lot of us where we sit in our little compartments. We engage with the economics and social domains, because we have these people sitting in their little compartment, and then you've got the political and institutional domains sitting in theirs. I believe we've got to bring it all together. We've got to draw them all together so we have an integrated package of all aspects. And it's very rare when you go to conferences or go to any big meetings and workshops where you have all three domains linked together. You usually end up with ecologists talking to each other, social scientists talking to each other, politicians and institutions not talking to anybody. And so what we've got to do is bring it all together. And we've got to find a mechanism for doing that. We tried it in Europe under the FAO regional body for Europe, and we had this conference of ecology and economics together. We had one economist attend. We don't want to listen to your ecological stuff. And the ecologist turned around and said, well, and we were all very unhappy by it, so we sort of gave him a mouthful back as well. But you've got to get these guys together, and we've got to find a way of doing it. And I think this concept of ecosystem services that's been developing and is evolving out of the Millennium Development Goals, out of the CBD, is actually the way forward for dealing with it. And if you have a look, this is the concept of ecosystem services, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail because I don't have the time, but basically we're looking at trying to maximize the wide range of benefits that healthy environments give to everybody, not unhealthy ones. And so we can actually keep the environment healthy, and it delivers an awful lot of services for people. Now, whether that's direct or indirect doesn't matter, but you can get benefits of good, clean water quality with fish in it, actually improves things like water supply, because you don't have to pay the cost of cleaning it up. You link those two together, suddenly you start to make money and get benefits of doing certain actions. And you can break them down into these supporting services, provisioning services, regulating and cultural services. And I'll come back to them in a minute to show you what I mean. I don't want to dwell on it here. But this concept is actually quite a smart concept which you can actually probably build on. And what I want to do is show you this through a couple of case studies. If I got the time, I can't see Bill. Yeah. One is on the Kafue Flats in the middle of the Zambezi Basin. Now, the Kafue River is actually the only, it's in Zambia only, it's exclusively in Zambia, and it drains into the Zambezi system just on the Zambian border. It's got lagoon systems like this. That's a beautiful picture of what it looks like when the rains have been through. There is unfortunately lots of water hyacinth in there and lots of problems, but I'm not going to talk about those. Here it is. So here's the Zambezi sort of running down through here, and you've got Lake Kariba, Kabora Bassa, and here it's run down here. And this is the Kafue area that I want to talk about. And here's Lusaka, the capital of Zambia. So it's in this lower part of southern Africa. Working here is a real challenge, actually, as I'll show you in a minute. I think I've got slides in here. So this is it, the main part of the flats. And what you've got here is the river normally runs down here, and the Zambians have dammed the lower part of it for hydropower. And then it runs into back here, it runs into the Zambezi proper. But they've put another reservoir at the top here called the Teshi Teshi for actually holding back water to supply this in low flow periods during the drought periods. And they get drought periods. And the river runs through, but the green area, or whatever colour it is to you out there, actually is the floodplain proper. So in the flooded period, that's what would be flooded. So you can see it's an important wetland area, hugely important wetland area. Working here is pretty tough, full of surprises. Transport's not very good, not as good as your car, Bill. And we'd have some real challenges for field work. And we didn't work on that day, let me tell you. For those who can't see at the back, this is 5 lions sitting in the shadow under the wing. This is what it looks like from the dry period to the wet period. So dependent on the flooding. The fisheries output is dependent on flooding in the wetland, a classic wetland flood setup. And here you have what's going on. This is a typical market taking place. This is the villages as they live. These people are poor. They live on $1 a day, $2 a day, except in the main fishing season when they actually have quite a lot more. And how they get rid of that money is another story. And they dry quite a lot of fish, or it goes chilled and iced up to the markets, or they dry it like this. You wouldn't want to get close to those. The flies are interesting. And this is typical of the environment they're living in the wet period. These guys are struggling. They've got dugout canoes. If they've got fiberglass canoes, which they've also can get access to, they tend not to use them because the hippos bite them in half and causes them all sorts of problems. So they tend to use wood because the hippos can't get the tusks through them. The pressures on this system, though, are intense. I've just mentioned about these 2 dams. So this is the lower Kafue Gorge down here. This is it downstream. That's the environmental flow. So the river is dry. All the water goes down a pipeline and comes out 10 miles downstream into the Zambezi. So you've got 10 miles of river with this bit of water actually is what's escaped through the dam because they've got something stuck in one of the gates, and so there's a bit of trickle. Normally it's absolutely dry. This is the Kafue discharging water to fill the floodplain and fill this up, and it can allow loads of water back and forward. What's happened as a result of this regulating reservoir and on fisheries is interesting. This is what's done on the flows. If you look at the red lines, that's what you would expect. And if you look on the black lines, that's what's happening now. And so what you've actually got is the low flow period, the dry period, is gone. Now the dry period is when they actually did recession agriculture in the area to make corn, grow corn and those sorts of things. And also, you need to dry the system out and re-flood it to get the wetland functioning properly and get the fish recruitment taking place. It's been taken out of the system. So the recruitment is changing. And this is seen in the fishery. This is when a Teshi Teshi was built. And this is the fish dynamics. There's a 7-year cycle actually taking place, which hopefully you can see there. a classic 7-year cycle, which is linked to the flood cycle, which you can't see very well in the blue, I don't think. And then we had to change the hydrology system. But there is a link between the floods and the fish production. The dam was built, it's gone. And you see it's fairly stable, although treat that with caution. And the dotted line here is actually the fish production from the reservoir that replaced it. So all in all, actually not much fish was lost in real terms, but this stability is an interesting component. What they're doing, though, is they're proposing that this dam is now used for hydropower because they want more power. And they're proposing that they're going to change the outputs from this dam from 29 cubic meters per second to 327 over a 15-minute period at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then ram it down again at 9 o'clock at night. So they're going to change the flows from, this is running at about 120 cumex. So they're going to ram it from nothing to a huge discharge of water, and in fact the water level will go up and down by 2.5 meters per day. And that's the proposal that's going in. And this wall of water, it'll be about here before it starts to dissipate. Those people living in this area, what they're going to do when they get this wall of water and they happen to be going to the toilet or washing or whatever, and suddenly a wall of water comes down. They won't know it's happening, although they'll learn very quickly, I suspect. They'll know what time it's going to potentially arrive. So this is the proposed system. Let's say this is about 120, so you can imagine how much more water is going to go down there. The major problems on the fishery and the way it's going to be affected. There is also another problem in that Nile tilapia have been introduced into this system, and about 50% of the catches now are this one species. They will actually take over and take out all the endemism and all the natural species in the system. They will wipe them out because they tend to do that. And when you put this water level fluctuation, they're the only species that will actually tolerate it. Everything else will go. They've also got red claw crayfish introduced from Australia, of all places, and it's all over the place. The local people don't know what to do with it, and it bites into the fish and ruins the fish quality, so they can't use it. I spent a few minutes with them one day saying, well, get a pot of whole boiling water and let's throw some in and show you how to deal with it. And they wouldn't eat it. To them, it's the devil. And that's really the words they used. They hated the thing. And I said, well, what do you do with them? Well, we throw them back. So they don't even get rid of them. So they're breeding like crazy. And so I opened one up, ate it, and they looked at me strange. A Mzungu, as they call me out there, in white man. And I said, well, try it. So they eventually got some to try it, and they can't get enough of it now. But then I told them what the market was. The value of these things in the Australian market and the Japanese markets is huge. You could get $3 or $4 each. So if you can create a market chain, you've got an even better use of them. The other problem that you've got is this thing called Mimoba pigra, which is introduced from, dare I say, Australia, which is a weed that grows, and it's got lots and lots of spines on it. And you can't get in it, and it's encroaching on the lake. And where it's encroaching is actually the breeding areas of the fish. So the fish can't get in there, and you can't get in there. The fishermen can't get in there. You can't get through it. And the reason it's actually happening is because this lack of dry period, flood period, has changed, and it's allowed it to grow. So the flooding would normally wash it out each year, but now you've changed the dynamics, it's stuck. And in fact, you can see the change in effect. This is over about 15-year period. It used to be just here, way out off the lagoons, and now it's all up this area here. So basically taking out the fish production. So what we actually did is, what we've tried to do in this case is to overcome these problems. We want these people to have their livelihoods, these local people, so that they've actually got their sustainable livelihoods, their fish, but they were just ignored. So how can we actually get them round the table to start discussing what's going on? And what we did is we adopted this ecosystem service approach. And so I built this model here of what are the ecosystem services delivery from this system. And I'll go through them very quickly. So these are the 4 criteria that Millennium Development Goals. And these are the important ones. There's the production of fish for food and other aspects. Basically, you're delivering an awful lot of protein for these people, which has to be supplied from somewhere else. You've got the hydropower, we can accept that. You've got recession agriculture, which is an important part in the dry season for these people when they can't fish. There's aquaculture production exploding in the area. There is the thing, it controls hazardous diseases, the water, because the flushing takes out the snails that give you the bilharzia, the malaria, and all those sorts of things. So there's a control that's actually lost by the change in these systems, which we can actually reintroduce, and it supplies clean water. You've got regulating services here. It regulates these invasive species. I've mentioned the mimosa. It's regulation of ecosystem resilience. The flooding and dry cycling is actually fundamental to it, to regenerate the floodplains. It's self-purification of water. It takes out all the rubbish. And in fact, that's quite common in this part of the world. These floods are critical for cleaning out the systems very quickly. It may end up in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, but at least it's not on their doorstep. And you've got flood control, because the flooding stops their villages being flooded, it stops cities being flooded. So some pretty serious stuff. And in this area, you've got some serious recreation and tourism activities. And I'll show you what they are in a second. So basically, we've got a big picture, and hydropower seems to be overruling it, but these are all equally important. When I actually looked at the fisheries proper, which is what I was sent in there to do, when you included all the fisheries that were not recorded, there's about 30,000 tonnes of fish, not 6,000 tonnes of fish per year caught, when you build it up properly. The value, about $40 million US. Suddenly, we're matching the value of the fishery to the hydropower outputs and making open people's eyes. And the dependence, the number of people depend on it was huge when we actually worked it all out. These are fundamental figures that you can put and get fisheries on at the table. We also looked at the, in the area, you've got sugarcane taking place, mining, sugar development. This sugar area was 27,000 square hectares, huge area of sugarcane, which is dependent on clean water from the system for, as a service. And then you've got fish farming, about 1,000 tonnes of fish coming out, again, dependent on clean water and availability of water. Put these guys together with the fish guys, and suddenly you're building up a lobby. But there's another. I mentioned nature and tourism. Here we have the dams, the floodplain area. You've got 2 nature reserves. In fact, this is the oldest nature reserve in Africa, and called Loch Inver. And it's actually fundamentally important for one species, and it's called the Kafui lechwe, which is just a gazelle-type species. But it lives in water. It almost walks across water. It's amazing to watch it run. And here they are running across the water, and they live on the new shoots coming as the water floods. So because the flooding is gone, these species are declining. They're an important asset to this country. So what we've also got, well, here you can see the numbers of numbers declining quite rapidly with time. And there's when the dam was closed. So what we've actually got is quite an integrated package here of fish, mining, the sugarcane. We've got the aquaculture development. We've got all sorts of people working together. And if we put them all together as a package, we can actually suddenly have a powerful argument against the hydropower people. And we did exactly that. We got the group, so we came from being individual voiceless people to being a powerful lobby. We put it together using these types of data. And we set up a cooperative and a co-management initiative. And we actually got them to regulate, or we're getting them to regulate the flows out of the dam. So they're changing. So you're not getting this 27 to whatever step up. They're actually controlling it. So there are benefits from the flows for the fisheries, for the sugarcane, for all these other people. And it's done through, I haven't got time, a whole institutional framework of this sort of nature, where you're actually dealing from the top down and you bring in all the different players together. Quite complicated to set up. But each person's got a voice in this system. So quite a powerful one. And this is the allocation of flows. I haven't got time to talk about it, but each person has got their own flows and how it's regulated, and each working group. So we're managing the system, and it's using this ecosystem services model to work. Now I know I'm going on a bit, but I'll just show you the Mekong one as an example of a slightly different scenario. This is the Mekong River in Southeast Asia. Huge fish production out of this sort of system. This is the Dai fishery, which produces about 1 million tonnes of fish out of one river a year. Absolutely unbelievable stuff. So it's from this region here, what's called the Tonle Sap, the Great Lake of Cambodia. And it floods backwards. And when the fish production is huge, it's a floodplain. And when it starts to drain away, when in the dry periods, the fish production comes down and they catch huge volumes of fish. What's happening here, here's the various production, the different levels. So you can actually see there's about 2.5 million tons of fish produced, protein about 10 million people. The lower area, the Cambodia area down here, it's about 1.3 million tons. The middle reach here is about 1 million tons, and up here, not so much, 60,000 tons of fish, but fundamentally very important to the fish community, the communities along the rivers. You've also got other pressures, as everywhere else. We've got agricultural development, massive fishing pressure. That very first picture in the introduction was the fishing at Cambodia just downstream of those dye fisheries. And each one of those boats you saw in that picture, spec, had at least a 50-metre gill net on it. So massive fishing pressure. You've got lots of flood problems going on, so they're trying to mitigate it. You've got alien species introduced. This is a piranha species from South America, got into the Mekong. It's a nonsense. Urban development, and a whole series of, this is fish exploitation down here. But the biggest threat is hydropower. These are typical of the dams going in on the tributaries. This is Namgon 1 in Laos, and they're just dams. There's no facilities for fish. There's no consideration for fish, and you're flooding back big areas which are main fish production areas. They do not produce the fish that the river used to in the past. They're just not up to it. And you get lots of sediment problems and all sorts of things caused by them. But what's going on in recent times is they are, the Lao government in particular, this area here, have decided they're going to be, quote, the battery of Asia. They're going to produce all the power that Asia needs. And what they're doing is they're going to build 10 or 11 big dams on the main stem Mekong. And this could have a huge impact on the fish populations. And it could actually reduce the fishery yield from the Mekong by about 60%. So those 10 million people, what are they going to do if they've lost all that food source? These are the dam sort of systems that are going in down through there in real terms. They're not quite big dams, they're only about 30, 35 metres high, and they're very typical of the ones that you have here, the Columbia Dam systems, very similar to that sort of thing. And the first one to go in is this one here called Xayaburi, which is the one I've been doing quite a lot of work on. And this is going to have quite an impact because it's a test case. And I'll show you what the outcomes of this has been. We did the ecosystem services, and when we started to put these things together, the key elements that came out were that hydropower was number one, and hydropower was number one, and hydropower was important, and that's all we kept on hearing. We're going to be the battery of Asia. So what about the fisheries? Oh, well, they'll look after themselves. What about navigation? Well, we'll put a fish lock past these. What about your rice and agriculture and the flooding that you require for it? Well, we'll put irrigation schemes in. So basically, hydropower was going to run over the whole system. We also, quite interestingly, started to look at the giant Mekong catfish. Now, the giant Mekong catfish goes to 200, 300 kilos. Massive things. Beautiful. Iconic. They catch about 7 or 8 a year. But they are culturally very, very important. And we said they'll die because they spawn right at the top. And in fact, if I go back, they actually spawn about here, we believe, above all the dams. And I don't know catfish that can climb dams. Maybe you have them in America. This is the place of it. So you can see it's beautiful landscape. And they're going to build a dam just across here, literally across here, and block all this system up. And this is the structure of it. Now, you may find this very familiar. This design is the Columbia River Dam system. Literally. In fact, these pictures are probably from the Columbia system, aren't they? And this is the fish pass they're going to put in. It's designed for salmon. They've got these baffles, which are about this far apart. And I said, when I first saw it, I said, well, how are you going to get the giant catfish? Oh, they'll get through. The giant catfish are about this wide. It's just a complete and utter nonsense. So we actually got hold of this, and we did, with the Mekong River Commission, we did quite a lot of work on it to try and actually reinvent this, because the bottom line of this is it's going to happen anyway. And what we did is we actually did this thing called the prior consultation to try and put this ecosystem services game together to deal with it. And we're explaining that there were large numbers of fish in this area that would be disappearing. There's about 200 species, and we did quite a lot of work to show this. Of which many of them are very important commercially. The trouble is, it's only 60,000 tons of fish. Only 60,000 tons of fish. The other thing was that the upstream migration that they had, as I've already said, vertical slot, designed for salmonids. These fish are, okay, the Mekong's fast flowing, but they're not fast flowing species. They can't take the gradient and they can't take these velocities. So the fish passes would be useless. Downstream migration is also useless. You've got to bear in mind lots of these fish migrate very long distances. I haven't got it here. Somewhere else. Very long distances upstream, and then the fish larvae drift downstream, thousands of kilometres. And they've got to come through this dam. How are they going to get through the dam? They'll come under what's known as a spillway, and the pressure there is so great they just explode. They also, so what we also looked at, we're arguing that the fish pass, the vertical slot, was useless, and then ineffective. They need some other solution. And it wouldn't work for all the different species there, the 200 plus species that we knew existed, and in the lower reaches, you've probably got another 300-400 species. They also argued that the fish pass the turbines, the fish would go through the turbines, but they're friendly. I do not know a fish-friendly turbine. I know mincing machines, I know patty-making machines, fish pate, but they are not friendly. And despite what they're saying, so because they've read it in the literature from the turbine people, they just live with it. We're friendly. The dam is also going to act as a hydrodynamic barrier because it's creating a reservoir, and once the fish start to drift downstream, they require the current. They get stuck in a still water area. They just sink and die. And the downstream facilities, the spillways, will just cause the problems I've talked about. And just to mention, so this is the actual movement of the fish and the sort of distance that they move. So the dam's going in here, and the migration routes are literally over thousands of kilometres. That will all be broken and disrupted. We did put together and try to put together this new design for them because in reality we knew this was going to happen. Power is important to the area, so they're going to build it anyway, so can we make solutions? And actually what we did is try to put in a natural fish pass. This actually goes up over here somewhere. Goes actually, it's 3.5 kilometres long. Goes up a river valley up over here, and it will get the fish up. It's a natural bypass channel. The trouble is it needs water, and we recommended 10% of the flow should go down there. They didn't like that, so they negotiated down 5%, and we know we can get away with 3%. But we didn't tell them that, and please don't tell them anymore. But in reality, we knew that we were going to get into a bargaining position. We created a fish pass through here, and this is the navigation channel, which we also modified so we can actually use that as a fish pass. So we've got 3 different sources getting fish up. So these are the ways of doing it. It's a fish lift, in fact, that we put in here and modify the channel. So I put those in so you couldn't see them. The problem is downstream migration. We still haven't resolved that problem. So you can get the fish up, but you can't get them down. Fundamental problem. So basically we have a fundamental problem on the whole thing, that the fisheries yield of the Mekong is going to collapse. Rural development of about 10 million people is going to disappear. Sediment delivery to the deltas is also going to be lost because it's going to get locked behind these dams. And nutrient delivery to the delta, which is a very productive area. The whole flooding regime of the production areas is altered. We tried to run the ecosystem services through here. We hit a political impasse. That's all I can say. Basically, this is the procedure that went on. The whole EIA went through. Even Vietnam and Cambodia governments complained about it. And they put in a 10-year moratorium in December 2011 to investigate it further. But just last month, the Lao government announced, despite political pressure from internally and in the region, from every government in the world, in fact, and everybody else, the World Wildlife Fund, everybody really had a go at them. They ignored it, and they've now started to build. They put the footings in already. In fact, they were doing it as we were talking. So, overridden. So, ecosystem services should function, but you've got to overcome political pressure. Okay, just to finish, a few conclusions for you. I actually think if we're going to get anywhere, we've got to change our thought process and our way forward from science and data-driven systems to actually getting outputs that are adopted by policy within the policy framework and within meet management needs, not do pure science, unfortunately. And I'm a scientist saying that. You've got to acknowledge that these developments are going to take place and focus the research on mitigation optimization, just as we did in the Zambia case study. We've got to find better ways of communicating what we're saying. It's not good. Fisheries people are, as I call it, pisky-centric. We talk to ourselves. We're not very good at talking outside the box and to other people. And I think using this ecosystem service approach is definitely the way forward. It's working in some cases, obviously not in others. And then we've got to find some wider way of integrating fisheries into bigger ecosystem planning, which is actually what the ecosystem services game is doing. But you've got to look at this multi-jurisdictional approach. So you've actually got to deal with different stakeholders and get them all together. And finally, I will leave you with my favourite slide of all, which some of you have seen. If you can explain to me what that means, because I don't know, and I've drunk a lot of gin and tonic trying to work that out. This is a sailing club in Jinja in Uganda, and what's it mean? Crocodiles do not swim here? There are crocodiles, you don't swim here? Tell me. There should be a comma somewhere, I think, or an exclamation mark. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Let me ask you the first one. You say the ecosystem service approach works for some cases, but not other cases. Can you elaborate a little bit more, like in the case that you just mentioned, why this case did not work out?
Why it worked in Africa and not in Asia is almost certainly down to the political framework you're operating under. Laos is a communist regime, and you can't tell them anything. The way we actually started to make them think is that we told them they're going to lose about 1 million tons of fish a year, and that's got to, so you're going to have to feed 30 million people. And the communist philosophy is, of course, you feed your people and you look after your people. So they've got to get that food from another source. And that's suddenly made them start thinking. But not enough, because basically you've got power, you've got money, and they can buy the food. That was their solution. But the reality is that money is not going to go anywhere near those rural poor people. So it's political, totally politically driven, and actually the political infrastructure you've actually got is what the problem was in that one. The other things are that corruption is huge, and corruption overrides a lot of this. In Africa is interesting, which my experiences of corruption are pretty high there. But what we found is that they were prepared to negotiate, and that framework I showed you, that institutional framework, in fact involved the chiefs of that region, and as long as they were involved, they control the system. So we got them in, and normally they would expect to take their 50% cut of the profit, but we actually marginalised them and they didn't realise it, and they signed all the documents away. But they were still happy because they were still making quite a lot of money. But it was we got the different levels and different tiers of management involved, whereas you couldn't do that in Laos. We couldn't even talk to the government properly. We just weren't allowed.
Yeah.
What's your experience with getting scientists to not be pure scientists? And I fully agree with you. Have you been successful in that?
I'm an oddball. In my university, there's my group, and we have a sister institute called the Institute of Coastal and Estuarine Studies, which deals with the same sort of work as I do, but in the marine systems, in coastal and estuarine systems. And they hate us. They absolutely hate us because we don't produce, dare I say it, nature papers. We don't produce all these high impact. We are, the IX is slightly bigger now as the coastal and estuarine one, and mine, we are the 3rd and 4th biggest earners in our university because we have external funding coming in, and we have what we call, the terminology was used by an FAO staff member at our institute a long time ago. He said, you do near market research. And on the day, actually, there was a call came for not near market. It actually said not near market research. And I won't tell you exactly what he said, but he said that's research that's no use to nobody. And I don't agree with that exact definition, but what we're trying to do is actually deal with the real work. And people are saying, well, how can you get all this money to do all this work? And we can't get hold of any. So teach us how you do it. And so we do that. And well, I don't want to do that. I want to count the number of hairs on the back leg of a donkey. And that's the problem we face. So we're quite ostracised in the group as such at the university. The university senior management love us because it's money and it's students and it's everything else. But our colleagues are not so friendly, I have to say. And it's very difficult to deal with it. So we make presentations like this. I'm going to give this actual presentation to my department in February. I've been asked to do it. And I know what the responses will be. But I'll live with it. Yeah. I'm thick-skinned, and I will continue drip feeding them. And some of them are beginning to shift to understand that their research should be driven towards the market needs. Yeah.
I saw a hand over here.
So in Michigan, if you had a choice of taking out dams but then letting in exotic sea lamprey, how would you apply your ecosystem?
I mean, what you've got to do is actually look at all your different services. And reality is that dams have their value. So leaving them in there for protection of the Great Lakes fisheries and the importance of that is absolutely fundamental to it. But what can you do with those dams? Can you modify them in any way to benefit the environment? So they're there anyway as such, rather than take them out. So modify them for the use that you want to get from them. But one of those uses is protection of the Great Lakes fishery and keeping the lampreys out. So therefore, fundamentally quite important. So you've got to balance it. You've got to do the economics behind it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be dollar value that you put on it. It's the awareness that these things are happening is often enough. And we didn't put huge dollar values on quite a lot of that stuff in Zambia. It was just the awareness of the bigger issues. And in fact, there's a lot more than that, which I haven't gone into. But when we put it all together, people, oh yeah, we forgot about that. Oh yes, that's quite important. So it's what your environmental objectives you've got to look at. And I would suggest protecting the Great Lakes fishery is very, very important for all sorts of reasons. Did I say the right thing, Chris?
I saw a hand, yeah.
Thanks for your lecture. I just have a quick question. You mentioned that the current conservation and conservation practice are driven by the Western export century to development, like protected areas, biological monitoring and restoration. But I was also thinking that the ecosystem service approach is also a Western anthropocentric diagram. So what do you think about the potential program of this?
Can we go for coffee? That's a really good question. I mean, it is a Western-driven concept, except I don't totally agree with that final part that it's totally Western-driven, because it's actually developed as part of the Millennium Development Goals at the Rio and Rio +20. And so every nation in the world was there. So that every nation in the world knew what they're buying into on that particular aspect. But I still agree with you, it is very Western driven because we have the resources to be able to deal with some of these things, and you've got to accept that these, as I keep on saying, these things are going to happen, but make them happen to benefit everybody as opposed to just to benefit hydropower or benefit agriculture, which is often the one that's going on. And just a point on, I mean, I took away protected areas. I said stocking and all those, I really gave them a hard time. Actually, they're quite important. They're one tool, or tools which can be used, and they're not tools I would say don't use. But think about why you're using them and if you're going to set up protected areas, think about what the protected area is. We used it on this, the Portuguese case study, which we did on the Cyprus. And what we realized is that the protected areas, we actually put protected areas in. But the protected area wasn't the river channel, which is what normally you get. It was the whole catchment area, the basin. So we got the land, everything protected, so nothing could happen in it to protect this species. And it still exists now, and it wouldn't, when we did the work 10 years ago, it was virtually on the edge of extinction. Now it's growing, the populations are growing, because we've actually got strong populations in these protected areas that we set up under European legislation, in fact. We even got Europe to come down on it, so it's great.
You describe this as a new paradigm, but I would argue with you that it's been around for a long time, and it just has not been adopted. Just an example, in the Great Lakes, much of the early management of the Great Lakes came around reducing nutrient input to improve water quality, building sewage treatment plants to deal with the humans in the area. And really it was ecosystem management on a big scale. It wasn't stock fish and that's all we'll do. But potentially, I suppose that approach has not been adopted much, but that approach seems to me has been around for quite a while.
Oh, I totally agree. I'm not, I mean, what I'm saying in the context of this talk is actually focusing on fish conservation and inland fisheries. It's actually not been adopted as much as it could be. It's been used for virtually everything, and you've got, I mean, in Europe we have the thing called catchment management planning is the big concept, which is exactly what we've done in the Great Lakes and all your rivers and things. So it's there, and in inland waters, it's actually there well advanced from marine systems. Marine systems are way behind us. But the problem we've actually got is it's not being used for fisheries purposes very much. It's actually being used for everything else, the wider catchment, so for agriculture, for forestry, all these big and natural resources which are transparent. And they're not used for fisheries, which unfortunately fisheries is not transparent enough, and we need to do it. And how do you make fisheries transparent? Years ago at a conference, and I actually made a presentation about this sort of process. How do you make them the charismatic megafauna you all hear about? And I actually had a kid's teddy bear, and I said how, and then I had a rainbow trout, a real rainbow trout, and I actually said to them, okay, which one of these would you go to bed with? And of course you got the lovely answer, the kid's teddy bear. And then somebody in the back of the audience, Gene Helfman, who some of you may know, actually said, I've got a stuffed paddlefish, a furry paddlefish, which he sent to me actually in the post afterwards. And he said, I've got to bed with that. But that's the reality. We're not making our fisheries charismatic enough. And we really do need to do it. And this is one mechanism for actually doing it.